Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Friday. This week we've been looking at 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, and Paul continues to brag on these believers and the testimony that they had toward the people that were around them and the people that Paul had heard from. In verse 9, Paul says, "For they themselves declare concerning us what manner of entry we had to you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and the true God." You know, when people met these new believers from Thessalonica, they were amazed. First of all, they said the word had sounded forth from them. It's exciting to hear young believers who can proclaim the truth and tell others what's happened in their lives. Second of all, he said their faith was so strong, he didn't even have to preach the word. It seemed like they had already heard the message. They were already excited to hear about this Messiah, Jesus, and what he had done in the lives of these believers. Now he says in verse 9 that those who witnessed their newfound faith were declaring to Paul and Silas what impact those missionaries had on them when they came. What kind of entering in, he said. I'm sure it was gratifying to hear that their preaching, that their witnessing had had such a positive effect on those in Thessalonica. But surely the greatest testimony that Paul heard about these new believers was how you turned to God from idols. You see, worshiping idols for many in that day was not just a practice of the people or a part of their city. It was their livelihood for some. Maybe they had even made and sold these idols. You know, Paul spoke of Demetrius over in the book of Acts whenever he went to the city of Ephesus. Demetrius was a silversmith. He had caused a lot of problems for Paul because he had lost money whenever people stopped buying his little images of the goddess Diana. And so as a silversmith, his whole business had changed, and he was mad at Paul about it. Wow. Wouldn't it be great if our following Jesus changed the culture around us and maybe the world lost some money? Their businesses hurt because of their sinful wares that they produce, and Christians no longer take part in it. Turning from idols was also a huge step for those people traditionally. Perhaps idols had become a prominent place in their home and even in their practices when their families would maybe weekly go to the temple of Diana and offer sacrifices or rituals. And all that changed now that they became believers. What is it in our lives that needs to change so desperately or so drastically that would make the biggest impact for the Lord and certainly would proclaim the gospel to those around us? He says here, they turned to God from idols to serve the living and the true God. You see, this living God has a history behind him from the Israelites. This living God has a written word of prophecy that they could read about. It was not like these inanimate objects that they had been worshiping all this time that were cold and dead and could certainly do nothing. They were powerless. They didn't just change their habits. They began to serve the true and living God. You know, we really need to see this type of transformation in our lives as believers, where we leave our past behind, everything changes, and we begin to worship and serve God in such a faithful manner that others take notice.